Welcome to Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from mystery lovers all around the world. Miss Marple and Lavender for the buried. Chapter 1. The Man in Black at the Magistrate's. On most market mornings in St. Netheridge, conversation ran to cabbages, to whether Mrs. Prowse's geraniums had outdone themselves, and to the vicar's sermon, which was thought by several to have been sound if a trifle long in the middle. But this morning, the ordinary talk had shrunk back, as if the village itself were holding its breath. People drifted, not to the green or the baker's, but toward the square of pale stone that housed the magistrate's court. There was a hum, low, urgent, and with the peculiar pitch that belongs to fear in company with curiosity. Miss Jane Marple, who disliked crowds, walked there nevertheless. She had meant only to return a book to Mr. Porch at the post office, Defoe imperfectly cut, and smelling of dust and oranges, but Mr. Porch's little lending shelf stood almost opposite the court, and one cannot return a book without noticing one's neighbours doing something unusual. Besides, Miss Marple held no contempt for curiosity. In villages, curiosity is the poor woman's police force, and has done better than the official one in more than a few instances. A fly drew up with a neat jerk before the court steps. The door opened. Out stepped a man in a black coat of the sort undertakers favour, black gloves, black hat brim low, a figure so entirely dark that only the eyes could be seen, pale under the shade. He carried a plain black valise. Two men got out behind him, lawyers by their collars and their brisk, reliable gait. And there were constables too, officious in that kindly way country policemen try for when a thing is serious. Mr. Porch, who had appeared at Miss Marple's left elbow in a manner suggesting rabbits and hedge gaps, whispered, "Name's Vale, used to be a junior groundsman at Warrender Abbey. They say he's to give evidence, Miss Marple. Private, but of course, in a village, privacy is a form of politeness rather than a fact." "Indeed," said Miss Marple mildly. "One often finds that privacy, like pastry, collapses under too much handling." They went inside, so did Miss Marple at a respectful distance, as one might follow a funeral for the sake of the family. The court smelled of beeswax and old ink. The dark man, Mr. Vale, stood at the rail with his lawyers flanking him like bookends. Near the front, Sir Lionel Ashcroft, senior trustee of the Abbey endowment, leaned on a silver-topped cane. He had a habit, Miss Marple noted, of aligning his knuckles and cuff as precisely as a footman aligns a knife with a plate. At his shoulder hovered Mr. Manley, the estate steward, narrow as a rule and twice as straight. Inspector Dale took a place by the door, expression set in that patient granite peculiar to good policemen when they suspect bad weather. The magistrate cleared his throat, and at the quiet scrape the crowd contracted into silence. "You wish to make a statement, Mr. Vale?" The man in black did not lift his head. His voice, when it came, was level and without wonder, the voice of someone who has practiced sentences until they fit like shoes. "I was engaged for river maintenance under the Abbey, to keep the banks tidy, the Willowmere Bend, the paths to East Copse, the ferry landing. I did keep them tidy, I kept other things tidy too." He paused. "I was told to." No one moved. Miss Marple watched hands, the way she always did when words began to matter. Sir Lionel's on the cane head, perfectly composed, Manley's thin fingers worrying at a ledger edge, Inspector Dale's thumb making an absent circle on the crown of his hat. In the public benches, Mrs. Hart, the Abbey housekeeper, sat very straight with her mourning veil folded up like a neat napkin against her forehead. Mr. Vale set the black valise on the clerk's table and undid the clasp. He did not flourish. He took out, with careful hands, a packet wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The clerk looked at the magistrate. The magistrate nodded. The paper came away. Within lay small bones cleaned of mud as one might clean a borrowed spoon, and a fragment of skull cap. Each was labelled in a cramped, old-fashioned hand, East Copse. Willow Path, Ferry Holt. A hush like a draught passed through the room. Mr. Vale spoke again, not faster, not slower. "There are more. I can show the places by walking, not on a map. Maps betray, feet remember." Someone in the back made a sound, half gasp, half prayer. The magistrate said something judicious about procedure and constabulary assistance. Mr. Vale, as if he had not heard, added a sentence that Miss Marple knew would lodge in the village and never leave it. "I did not choose it. I was made to choose nothing." He swallowed. "But the ground will speak." Miss Marple's mind, which is a very tidy one, filed the sentences in their places, and then went searching in the drawer marked "smell." There was faintly, beneath wax and ink, a sweetness on the air. Lavender. Someone, somewhere near, had used it very liberally, as one does when one wishes not to smell something else. She glanced toward Mrs. Hart, and saw, for the briefest moment, the woman's fingers pressed together as if to keep them from trembling. Outside, the square wore its shock awkwardly, like a borrowed coat. People did not at once remember what to do with their hands. The florist's barrow by the railings had, rather cheerfully, a row of jam jars with sprigs of lavender tied by blue string. A small coincidence, perhaps, and yet the nose is a companion to the conscience. Miss Marple paused by the barrow and spoke to Tilly Drew, who minded it when her mother went in for pins. "Lavender does for moths and for linens," Miss Marple observed. "Mamma says it keeps away wicked smells," Tilly returned. "But I think wicked smells go round to the back." "Wickedness often does," Miss Marple said, and paid for a small sprig, because it is wise to carry the emblem of a thing one expects to meet. She walked, not home, but riverward, because one can understand a statement better by looking at the scene of it. The willow path left the road after the mill and ran with a guilty air along the water's edge. August had baked the track into hard, shallow footmarks. Below, the Willowmere moved with the respectable indolence of middle age. Miss Marple carried her parasol low and looked as old ladies may look without offence at the small domestic traces that collect where women have been. A thread of ribbon snagged on nettle, the tin top of a scent bottle, a faint oval patch where the grass had learned regularly to bend under a kneeling body, washing perhaps or praying. There is not so much difference as people suppose. A voice hailed her from the ferry landing. Joel Pike, who had ferried boys and bicycles since bicycles were worth ferrying, lifted his cap. "Treacherous turn just there, miss," he said, nodding to the willow bend. "Takes what it can." "It also returns a little," Miss Marple said. She pointed with the parasol tip to a dull gleam half sunk near the reed border. "Buttons, quite often." Joel grinned bleakly. "Ah, buttons! There's more truth in a fallen button than in most men's speeches." Miss Marple agreed. She had, in her sewing basket, a handful of truths acquired over the years. Buttons run away where shame cannot. When she came back into the square, Mr. Porch was in a state compounded of triumph and distress. "They say," he confided, leaning in as if the very air were eavesdropping, "they say Vale will take them to the places, walk them there, mind you, and not a blessed thing must be marked on paper for fear the wrong people get there first. Inspector Dale's not best pleased. The inspector likes paper." "The river prefers feet," Miss Marple said, "and so do old wrongs. They are very old-fashioned." It is an odd thing about a village. It can keep a secret like a miser, and it can spend one like a drunken sailor. By tea time, St. Netheridge had done both. Warrender Abbey, Its terraces, its drying room in the lesser wing, its vast arrangements of linen and dignity was said to be at the heart of the matter, and people spoke the name curtly, as they do when courtesy has worn thin. Miss Marple, who had never believed great houses necessarily great in anything that matters, tied on a plain hat and went to the vicarage, where the kettle speaks a dialect of comfort, and the ledgers live in a box under the stairs. She did not ring at once. Through the open window she heard the murmur of voices, a little circle of the parish glued together by cake. Dr. Lytton was there. One could always tell him by his careful laugh, as neat as his cuffs. Mrs. Prowse, who fussed over the Abbey's flowers, fluttered. Mrs. Ellis of the sweet shop murmured her opinions, which are always tender to the living and ruthless to the dead. And Inspector Dale, not a great man for tea, had been dragged in by the vicar, and now stood with an air of having promised not to bite anyone's head off. Miss Marple entered, as one might enter a nursery, cheerfully and without apology. There was a shift in the room, a widening as people make in their chairs for an aunt who, whether invited or not, generally improves matters. They spoke, of course, of accidents. Dr. Lytton said there had been slips by the river in all seasons, and some poor girls who worked at the Abbey had not the good sense God gives a rabbit. He spoke of floods that had never been quite as much as his adjectives implied. Miss Marple admired his hands, well cared for, and faintly stained, not with ink, but with something resinous. She did not sniff like a hound, as that would have been vulgar, but she allowed the air to come to her. Creosote, a whisper said, or tar preparations. The sort one uses to keep vermin from timber, or to smother other scents beneath a dense, practical honesty. And then there is lavender, Mrs. Prowse put in. We have such a time of it at the Abbey, with moths. Mrs. Hart swears by lavender in the airing cupboards. You never smelled such cupboards, Miss Marple. I dare say, said Miss Marple, airing cupboards often tell stories. They are like old ladies, full of other people's things and determined to keep them in decent order. Inspector Dale, who had been silent with the intensity of a man trying not to agree with his enemies, addressed Miss Marple directly. You've a way of seeing what's under your nose, Miss Marple. If you should notice anything in the next day or two, anything in particular, I'd take it kindly if you told me. Oh, Inspector, Miss Marple said, with the mildness that conceals both steel and affection. I notice an awful lot. The difficulty is to know in time which bit will matter. On her way home, she met Mrs. Hart coming through the Abbey side gate with a brown paper parcel tied with twine. They exchanged the ritual politenesses, weather, the vicar's sermon, the price of sugar. A breath of scent rose when the parcel knocked lightly against Mrs. Hart's glove. Lavender, said Miss Marple, as one might remark on the quality of a shawl. For the cupboards, Mrs. Hart returned, eyes steady, voice quite even. It keeps what ought to be kept, and discourages what ought not, Miss Marple agreed. It is a very respectable scent. When Mrs. Hart had gone, Miss Marple stood a moment under the elms and looked up at the Abbey's smaller windows. She had been a maid once in a big house, briefly and not happily. She knew the difference between linen for guests and linen for mopping. She knew about sheets called household and sheets called servants, and how sometimes the great houses muddled their categories when it suited them. She had also learned long ago that scandals in big houses do not usually begin with the bedchamber, but with the laundry. That evening she took down her tin of useful odds and ends, bits of ribbon, unfamiliar buttons found in hedgerows, a single cork from a bottle that had no business on a church path. She added to it the little lavender sprig from Tilly's barrow and wrote, in her small, upright hand on a slip of paper, Vale, walked places, not maps, Abbey linens, lavender, too much. She tucked the note beneath the cork and looked at her tidy row of teacups. Death behaves badly everywhere, she reflected, but in villages it at least has the decency to be known by its habits. At 9:30, there was a knock at her door, hesitant, not supplicating, but like that of a man who has decided to be brave for 10 minutes and does not know if he can manage 11. Miss Marple opened it to find Mr. Vale hat in hands. Up close, his black coat was not the professional black of an undertaker, but the makeshift black of a man who has collected darkness as a disguise, a re-dyed jacket, an old wool scarf pressed into service. His eyes did not settle. They moved as eyes do that have learned too much in the dark. "Ma'am," he said, "I am told you see things, the right things. They say you will not make me out braver than I am, nor viler." "I generally contrive to manage the truth," Miss Marple said. "Come and sit by the fender. I have seed cake. It comforts one, even when it does no good." He did not eat. He looked at the fire as if it reminded him of something else altogether. "I thought," he said, "that doing right would feel like being washed. It feels like being scrubbed with sand. I shall be sent to prison, I suppose." "Very likely," Miss Marple said, and spared him the nonsense decent people murmur at such moments. "The law likes to tidy its drawers, but perhaps," she added, "the law will tidy other drawers at the same time." He shut his eyes once, briefly. "I can show them where. I will walk, but I won't mark maps. They get into wrong hands." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Maps and secrets both have a habit of finding the pockets for which they were stitched." He hesitated at the door. "There was a girl," he said, and stopped. "Several. Young, some in aprons, one in a school frock." He swallowed. "They said she had run wild. I saw her satchel. I never saw a satchel run." Miss Marple's fingers, which are extremely good at knitting even when the mind is not on the pattern, tightened on nothing at all. "Thank you, Mr. Vale," she said. "You have done a terrible thing and a necessary one. The village will try to do the other necessary things. We must all be very tidy now." When he had gone, she set her clock, drew her curtains and wrote 2 notes. One was to the vicar, requesting access to parish relief ledgers for the last 20 years. For a matter of domestic curiosity, she put, which would satisfy him because it was both untrue and quite exact. The second went to Inspector Dale, containing only 6 words. "Ask for deliveries, tar, creosote, lavender." He would blink, poor man, and then he would go and ask. That is a virtue in a policeman. Jane Marple, who has been old long enough to be accustomed to it, sat with her hands folded for a few moments more. She thought of girls who walk to work with ribbon in their hair, and of cupboards that smell overwhelmingly of lavender. She thought of great houses that call their sins by clean names, and of rivers that remember what land forgets. Then, being herself, she rose, washed her cup and saucer, and laid out a simple black dress for the morning. There is a costume for grief, and there is a costume for truth. In villages one is often mistaken for the other, and it is prudent to be ready for both. Chapter 2, Whispers, by the Willowmere. The next morning was bright, though the air carried that faint metallic edge which suggests rain before the week is out. Miss Marple, carrying a sensible basket ostensibly for herbs, set off toward the Willowmere. She did not believe in waiting for clues to come knocking. One found them by walking the places other people avoided. At the bend, where the bank sloped sharply into green water, Joel Pike, the ferryman, was leaning on his pole. He touched his cap. "Bad turn here, miss. More than one gone in over the years." "Yes," Miss Marple replied mildly. "And sometimes things come out again, don't they?" She indicated with her parasol a small scrap caught in the reeds, a strip of cheap blue ribbon frayed at the ends. Joel moved to fetch it, but she stopped him. "Best to leave it where it lies for now. The river keeps its own accounts. Following the narrow path toward East Copse, she let her eyes drift in that apparently aimless way which often revealed more than a policeman's torch. A cork from a scent bottle lay half-pressed into the soil, stamped faintly, S. Lavender. A yard further, a flattened oval in the grass where someone had knelt often enough to teach the blades the habit. Not many would notice. Miss Marple always did. Near the blackberry hedge, a child in a sun hat was picking fruit with exaggerated care. "Mamma says not to go past the bridge," the girl told her. "Abbey men don't like it." "What do Abbey men fear, I wonder?" Miss Marple asked. The child, with the bluntness of her age, said, "Ladies who talk." Miss Marple smiled and moved on. That afternoon at the vicarage, the parlour was full for tea. Dr. Lytton, neat as always, sat beside Mrs. Prowse, who spoke in her breathless way about Abbey flowers. Inspector Dale appeared, an unusual guest for such gatherings, but the vicar had lured him with cake. Mrs. Ellis from the sweet shop nodded to Miss Marple, her eyes eager for news. The talk, as expected, turned to Mr. Vale. The inspector kept his face carefully blank, but Miss Marple noted he listened rather harder than he sipped. Dr. Lytton spoke of tragic accidents by the river, floods, slippery banks, careless girls walking home in poor shoes. He did not, however, meet anyone's eye when he spoke. His fingers, pale and well kept, bore a faint stain. Not ink. Resin? No, creosote, Miss Marple decided, the sort used for timber or to mask less pleasant odours. Mrs. Prowse fluttered that the Abbey had lately cleared a terribly dusty drying room in one of the lesser wings. "Old linens, milady said we use lavender oil for freshness. Mrs. Hart insists on it." "Lavender is admirable," Miss Marple said. "So good for keeping things from spoiling." Mrs. Ellis leaned forward. "I always say, if something smells too strong of lavender, there's another smell underneath." Inspector Dale gave the smallest of smiles. "And you'd be right, Mrs. Ellis." Miss Marple let her eyes wander to the sideboard. On it sat a folded parish relief ledger left there carelessly by the vicar. She knew those ledgers and how abruptly names could vanish from them. After tea, Miss Marple lingered to help the vicar stack chairs, a pretext for glancing at the ledger. Her fingers found the right page without seeming to search. Several entries for temporary help at the Abbey stopped suddenly, marked in a neat hand, "Returned to family, engagement dissolved, unfit." The handwriting was Mr. Manley's. She had seen it on estate notices for years. Outside, the lane to the Abbey was quiet. Mrs. Hart emerged from the gate with a parcel under one arm. They exchanged polite phrases. The weather, the price of sugar. The twine on her parcel was darkened in 2 spots as though oil had seeped through. "Lavender again?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. "Yes," Mrs. Hart replied, her tone even. "For the cupboards, it keeps what should be kept." "And discourages what ought not," Miss Marple agreed. They parted, but the faint scent clung in the air behind her, stronger than fresh flowers, sharper than sachets. Miss Marple walked on, thinking of old houses where linen cupboards hid more than moths. That evening, she opened her own small box of odds and ends, buttons, ribbons, scraps of fabric with stories in them. She added the cork from the river and the blue ribbon from East Copse. Then she wrote a brief note to Inspector Dale. "Check Abbey deliveries, tar, creosote, lavender. Past 5 years." She sealed it, placed it by the lamp, and sat back. Somewhere beyond her garden, the river turned its slow green curve, patient as memory, and Miss Marple, who knew that patience and memory often worked hand in hand, resolved to walk the willow path again before the week was out. Chapter 3. Ledgers, Linens, and a Name. The following day had the clear, washed look of weather that means to behave. Miss Marple took advantage of it to pay a call at the vicarage about the missionary sale, which is the most elastic of English pretexts and stretches nicely to include ledgers. The vicar's study smelled of clean dust and hymn-book leather. On the table, as if Providence had laid them out, were 2 parish relief books and a donation ledger bound in cracking calf. "Such a comfort you are, Miss Marple," the vicar said, searching under papers for his spectacles, which were perched upon his head. "If you would sort these years, just a glance, one becomes muddled." Miss Marple, who never became muddled with numbers that belonged to human lives, turned pages with the tender efficiency one uses for old linen. Names she knew and names she had only half known paraded by in ink that had faded to tea. Mabel Price, temporary laundry; Lydia Harrow, kitchen girl; Ivy Dean, seamstress, trial week. Their allowances ceased abruptly. No forwarding address, no marriage entry, no funeral. Margin notes, precise and faintly superior, appeared beside several endings. Returned to family. Unfit. Engagement dissolved. The hand was Mr. Manley's. One could tell by the tidy way he crossed his T. Miss Marple closed the relief book and drew the donation ledger nearer. There, in Sir Lionel's bold signature, were 3 benevolences to the parish for the succour of bereaved families, each in a spring that had not, as far as any rain barrel remembered, been a season of flood. She made a small, contented sound one might mistake for a sigh. Patterns are very obliging once they know they have been seen. "Anything useful?" the vicar ventured, trying not to peer. "Useful to moths," said Miss Marple, smiling. "And to memory." She left him with his spectacles properly returned to his nose and walked along the high hedge toward Warrender Abbey. The great house, pale as a bleached bone upon its terrace, wore its windows shut against morning. Miss Marple presented herself not at the big front but at the lesser side door, which has always been where truth and tradesmen do best. Mr. Manley met her with a courteous wince, as men do when they suspect they are about to be asked something exact. "Miss Marple, what a surprise." "Oh, not at all," she said pleasantly. "I wanted to admire your drying arrangements. Mrs. Prowse was lyrical about them." "The drying room?" His smile trembled. "There is nothing to see, merely household business." "Household business," Miss Marple agreed, and let the words sit between them until they grew uncomfortable. Manley took up a ring of keys and led the way down a short corridor where air lay heavy with the sweet, stale insistence of lavender oil. The room he opened was brick-floored, with a blackened beam and a window levered low to catch such breeze as a house allows its servants. A mangle stood, dignified in senility. On pegs hung a mixture of linens, some coarse with years of honest washing, others of a fineness that suggested guests and good sheets. Miss Marple's fingers, which never pour, drifted to her hem. It felt faintly waxy, as if something thicker than soap had married with the fibre. On the beam, her gloved knuckle came away with a smear. "Tar," she murmured, without accusation. So very efficient at discouraging vermin, and other inquisitions. Manley's smile tightened. "You must appreciate, Miss Marple, that a large house has odours particular to its size. One fights them as one can." "Of course." She glanced toward a wooden crate in the corner. Within, wooden laundry pegs lay in a jumble beside a shallow tin that once held sweets. She lifted the tin's lid a fraction. It contained 2 black horn buttons, plain, with tatters of linen thread still clinging, one smeared faintly with what might be tar. Miss Marple replaced the lid exactly as she had found it, and looked with approval at the coil of hemp rope looped neatly on a peg. "You are very tidy, Mr. Manley," she said. "Tidy men are the backbone of England." He bowed in that tiny way Englishmen do when they feel their spine questioned. Stepping out into the lightened corridor, Miss Marple all but collided with Mrs. Hart, who carried a small brown paper parcel tied with twine darkened at 2 points by oil. The housekeeper's face was set to that pleasant neutrality which says a woman has long practiced laying herself aside. "Forgive me?" Mrs. Hart said. "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "Lavender is so excellent for cupboards." "For cupboards," Mrs. Hart said, "and for peace. One never pursues a woman's confession when she has given one word of it freely. It is bad husbandry." Miss Marple let the silence sit. After a heartbeat, Mrs. Hart added very quietly, "Mondays. We aired on Mondays. Mr. Manley liked to count." Miss Marple touched the parcel with a finger. "I expect he counted well." She let Mrs. Hart pass. Outside, on the servants' path, a drayman was unloading 2 tins marked in black capitals, creosote and tar prep. The smaller crate bore a neat label, Ashcroft Purveyors, Lavender Oil, Household. The footman signing the chit glanced over his shoulder nervously, and Miss Marple noticed the receiver's name, Dr. Lytton, penned neatly by a hand that liked tidy receipts. "Odd," Miss Marple observed aloud, to no one in particular. "Physicians have so many calls upon their pockets." She left by the orchard gate and walked the lane. Halfway along, Lady Ashcroft's motor drew up with the whispery complaint of a vehicle that has only lately been forgiven for being modern. Lady Ashcroft, sleek and grave, rolled down the window. "Miss Marple, I hope you will not judge us all by village talk." "I try never to judge anyone by anything less than their linens," Miss Marple said. "One can tell a very great deal from laundry." Lady Ashcroft managed to laugh, and then, quite suddenly, a tremor. "I have spoken to Sir Lionel about opening accounts to the police, our staff lists, the old hiring books. He says it would be an indignity to the Abbey." "Inconvenience and indignity are cousins," Miss Marple returned gently. "Where there is grief, one prefers inconvenience." Lady Ashcroft's gaze dropped to her gloves. "There was a summer party," she said, almost to herself. "Years ago, I had the lawn photographed. I keep the frame face down. It upsets the light." "The light is easily upset," Miss Marple agreed. When the motor moved on, Miss Marple took the little path that skirts the river and comes up at Joel Pike's ferry. He stood with a cigarette at the corner of his mouth, blowing his smoke downstream as if it might move the current along. "You and your river," Miss Marple said. "It keeps counsel," Joel replied. "But it gossips with its banks." He tipped his chin toward a sandy shelf below the willow roots. "See the rise there, miss? Bank went up 2 inches that year and there weren't no flood. Someone's shovel, not God's rain." "Quite," said Miss Marple. She looked at the roots, pale scars where water should have scoured and had not. "You will remember Monday nights, Joel?" "Monday was always busy at the Abbey. Linen night," he spat thoughtfully. "Funny what people wash and what they won't." In the afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call upon Mrs. Ellis at the sweet shop. There are questions one cannot ask a man with a notebook but can cheerfully put to a woman with a toffee hammer. Mrs. Ellis, who had a talent for serving humbugs and truths in equal measure, produced a box of old parish news from under the counter. "Volunteers for Abbey festivities," Mrs. Ellis read, tapping a notice from a June long past. "Founders' fair, girls invited for trial week, laundry, kitchen, sewing." Such a flutter there was. Mabel Price went. So did Lydia Harrow. She shook her head. Mabel's mother said she'd taken up a position in Basingstoke. Funny how letters never came. Miss Marple took the brittle sheet between careful fingers. A thumb smear darkened the date, as if someone had turned that page many times with a hand that worked in oil. "Would you?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Happen to remember who posted the notices for the Abbey in those days? Oh, Mr. Manley, always. No one else could fold corners so sharp. You could cut your finger on his memos. Miss Marple went next to Dr. Lytton's surgery with a jar of calf's foot jelly for his housekeeper, a present that tends to pry open doors. The waiting room smelled faintly of camphor and, beneath it, a sweetness. In the surgery proper, a shallow tin on the hob simmered a little oily slick. On the shelf above, a silver two-pronged corkscrew polished fastidiously. "Household measures," Dr. Lytton said easily when she remarked the scent. "Country air is damp. I burn a little oil now and then for hygienic reasons." "Hygiene," Miss Marple repeated, as one might repeat love when a man uses the word to excuse himself. Her eyes drifted to a small, framed photograph on his desk. Founders Fair, June. Dr. Lytton, 20 years younger, laughed beside a girl in a patterned frock with a sprig of lavender tucked at her bodice. The frame's glass was clean. The silver mount bore the tiniest scratch by the date, as if a thumbnail had worried it. "Charming," Miss Marple said. "One doesn't keep old things for charm," he replied, too quickly. "For record." "Records," Miss Marple said, "are often charming when they ought to be merely true." She left him with his jelly and his well-cut evasions and walked home by way of the churchyard. There she sat on a low wall and wrote 2 notes in her compact upright hand. One to Inspector Dale. "Please request Abbey staff rosters and hiring records for Founders Fair years. Compare against parish relief stoppages. Ask also for delivery chits from Ashcroft purveyors, tar, creosote, lavender, signed by whom?" The second, addressed to Lady Ashcroft. "Might I borrow the lawn photograph for a day? I own a glass that enlarges threads." As the bell tolled 6, she added a final item to the little tin in her parlour drawer, the corkscrew memory, as she thought of it, and sat a moment, listening to the village resume the work of pretending. St. Netheridge was polishing its surfaces, as respectable places do when scandal breathes nearby. But Miss Marple had no intention of being dazzled by polish. She had learned long ago that the truth about big houses is written in laundry lists and the truth about rivers in raised banks. Between the two, one could sometimes thread a neat needle through 20 years of silence and see at last what pattern the stitches had been making. She folded her hands. "We must be very tidy," she told the room. "If one must lay a table for truth, one lays it properly." And with that, she set out 2 cups. She had an idea that truth, when it arrived, would bring a guest. Chapter 4. The Trunk in the Parlour. The following morning, a discreet knock came at Miss Marple's door. Inspector Dale stood there in his plain brown coat, hat pulled low, looking more like a man on parish business than a police officer. "I've had the first of those delivery records from Ashcroft purveyors," he said in a low voice once inside. "They go back 12 years. Regular orders of creosote, lavender oil, and tar every quarter. All signed by Mr. Manley, except 2 in Dr. Lytton's name." "2 is enough to be interesting," Miss Marple said, pouring him tea. "What of the hiring records?" Dale shook his head. "Sir Lionel says they've been misplaced. Manley claims they were destroyed in a storeroom leak." Miss Marple's needles clicked as she considered this. "Leaks are so obliging, aren't they? They appear precisely where embarrassment is stored." Dale had brought something else. The name and address of Mrs. Gwen Roper, a laundress who had retired to a small stone cottage on the far side of East Copse. Her knees were poor, but her memory was excellent. "Abbey Laundry, was it?" Mrs. Roper said when Miss Marple and the inspector were settled in her neat parlour. Hot as blazes in summer, cold as the grave in winter, Mrs. Hart ran it like a ship's deck. But it was Mr. Manley who counted the bundles. Every Monday night, Miss Marple asked, setting her teacup on its saucer without a rattle. Without fail, came in with a ledger and a pen you could smell the ink of. We washed guest linen, staff uniforms, odd bits for the village when the Abbey was in charity mood, but there were nights when something came down that wasn't on any list. What sort of thing? Dale leaned forward. Mrs. Roper pursed her lips. Sheets, with the corners cut away, pillowcases with the seams unpicked, and once, a gown. Young girls, blue sprig cotton, torn across the bodice. Mr. Manley had it put in a sack straight off. Miss Marple glanced at the shelf, where a small brass key hung on a nail. You are tidy, Mrs. Roper. I see you keep your keys in order. The laundress smiled faintly. One key too many, mind you. Found it in the pocket of an old work apron when I left the Abbey. Never fit any door I owned. But it fits something in this house. From the corner, she brought out a battered leather trunk. The key turned smoothly. Inside lay neatly folded cloths, a few moth-nibbled shawls, and at the bottom, a flat parcel wrapped in brown paper. Mrs. Roper hesitated only a moment before untying the string. It was the blue-sprigged cotton gown. The tear across the bodice had been roughly mended, as if only to hold it together for storage. There were faint, brownish marks at the hem, not mud. Why did you keep it? Dale asked. Because Mr. Manley told me not to, she said simply, and I never did care for being told. Later, as Dale took the gown into evidence, Miss Marple walked alone back toward the village. Her route brought her past the surgery. Dr. Lytton himself was at the door, locking it. Miss Marple, he said, with a warmth that felt just short of real. I was sorry to miss you yesterday. I had to attend Sir Lionel, a bad turn with his nerves. That must have been difficult, with you delivering to the Abbey in the same morning, she remarked. His expression tightened. Abbey? No, I haven't been up there for weeks. She tilted her head, the way one might when hearing a bird sing out of season. Memory is a curious thing, Doctor, so very particular about what it chooses to keep. That evening, Miss Marple sat with her notebook. She wrote down 3 items: orders, signed by Dr. Lytton, not Manley; gown with tear and stains, kept in trunk; denial of recent Abbey visit. Then she added, in neat, underlined script, why cut the corners from sheets? She had known too many women who made shrouds to mistake the significance. Chapter 5. The photograph on the lawn. 2 days later, Lady Ashcroft herself came to Miss Marple's cottage, the framed photograph wrapped in silk, as if it were a christening gift. She placed it on the table, face down. I've kept it put away, Lady Ashcroft said quietly. But you asked, and... Well, you're the only one I trust not to gossip. Miss Marple lifted the silk, turned the frame over and studied the scene. The Abbey lawns in high summer, trestle tables laden for the Founders' Fair. The faces were small, the light bright. But Miss Marple's glass, a neat oval on a mother-of-pearl handle, brought them up one by one. Sir Lionel with a drink. Dr. Lytton, younger, in conversation with a girl in a blue sprig cotton gown, her hair tied with a pale ribbon. Mr. Manley, standing behind them, gazed not on the festivities, but on the river path beyond. What is her name? Miss Marple asked, pointing. Lady Ashcroft looked away. Lydia Harrow, one of the laundry girls. She left suddenly. Ah, said Miss Marple, as if that explained the weather. That afternoon she took the photograph to Joel Pike, the ferryman. Do you remember this day? She asked. Joel squinted, then chuckled without humour. I remember the heat, and I remember that girl, the blue dress, came down to the river after lunch, said she wanted to dip her feet. I told her the bank was slick. She laughed, went up toward the orchard instead. And after? Miss Marple prompted. Joel tapped the side of his cigarette packet. Never saw her again, but that night there was a bonfire behind the gardener's sheds. Smelt strange, not wood smoke. The Abbey's head gardener, Mr. Fenwick, was a wiry man with a fondness for roses and a wariness of questions. Miss Marple found him cutting back a tangle of lavender near the orchard wall. "Shame to cut them now," she said mildly. "Too much lavender draws wasps," Fenwick replied. "Sir Lionel likes things tidy." Her eye drifted to his hands, nails rimmed with a faint greenish stain. "And what are you working with today?" "Copper solution," he said, "for blight." Miss Marple's mind flicked to the gown in the trunk, the faint green streaks at the hem, not grass after all. Copper does not wash out easily, nor does it arrive without purpose. She asked to see the orchard wall. Fenwick hesitated, then led her along a narrow path. At the far end, where the wall dipped toward the river slope, a patch of earth lay bare, the grass there shorter, newer. Beside it, a row of lavender bushes had been cut back hard, almost to stumps. "Replanted here last spring," Fenwick said, too quickly. Miss Marple knelt, touched the soil. The scent of lavender oil was strong, stronger than growing plants alone would give. She brushed back a bit of earth with her gloved hand. The soil beneath was dark, damp, and there, just visible, the corner of coarse linen, frayed. "Your replanting is vigorous, Mr. Fenwick," she said, straightening. "One might almost call it covering." Fenwick said nothing. His eyes went to the house, then back to her. That evening, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk and added a new line to her notes. "Photograph proves presence. Lydia Harrow. Copper stains. Fresh earth by orchard wall. Linen corner visible." And beneath it, "Burial not far from lavender beds." She put down her pen, folded her hands and looked out at the darkening street. In St. Netheridge, people closed their curtains early these days. Too much lavender in the air, perhaps. Chapter 6. What the lavender hid. It was past 9 in the evening when Inspector Dale arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with a spade wrapped in sacking. "Best go now," he said quietly. "Fenwick's at the public house and won't be back before closing." The orchard was still, the lavender beds pale smudges in the dim light. They worked in silence, Miss Marple keeping watch while Dale loosened the soil by the wall. The scent rose sharply as roots gave way. Within minutes, his spade struck cloth. Carefully, he pulled free a bundle, coarse linen, stained darker in places, tied with frayed blue ribbon. When he unwrapped it, a smaller object fell into his palm, a hair comb, tortoiseshell, with 3 teeth broken. Miss Marple held it to the lantern. "Not factory cheap, a gift perhaps, and I've seen it before." Dale looked up sharply. "Where?" "In Mrs. Hart's room. She used to wear it on Sundays." The next morning, Miss Marple called at the Abbey under the pretence of delivering lavender cuttings for the kitchen. Mrs. Hart received her in the servants' hall, her smile polite but tight. "Such a fine scent," Miss Marple said, setting down her basket. "One could almost mistake it for the oil you use." Mrs. Hart's hands stilled on the tablecloth she was folding. "We keep the place fresh. Sir Lionel likes things sweet-smelling." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "though I expect the scent clings even to things buried a year or more." Mrs. Hart looked up quickly. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I'm sure you don't," Miss Marple said with that mildness which always made the guilty uneasy. In the corridor she passed Dr. Lytton speaking low to Mr. Manley. The words were indistinct, but the tone was urgent. Manley's eyes followed her until she turned the corner. By the time she reached the lane, Miss Marple was certain of one thing. Her presence at the Abbey was no longer regarded as harmless. That evening, as she tended her roses, she found the latch of her garden gate unfastened. She always latched it. and in the gravel path, half hidden, was a sprig of lavender tied with blue ribbon. She picked it up, studied it, then carried it inside to place beside the hair comb on her writing desk. Chapter 7. The Vicarage Tea. Miss Marple rarely asked the vicar's wife for favours, but that afternoon she telephoned from the post office kiosk. "A small tea, dear, just half a dozen. I'll bring the cake." By 4 o'clock, the drawing room at the vicarage smelled of lemon sponge and fresh polish. The guests were a curious mix: Dr. Lytton, Mr. Manley, Mrs. Hart, Fenwick the gardener, and Lady Ashcroft. Inspector Dale, in plain clothes, sat by the window with an air of polite disinterest. "I do so love tea," Miss Marple began as cups were handed round. "It reminds me how much people's lives can be traced in the smallest of things. A bill for sugar, a delivery slip, a button found in the wrong place." Mrs. Hart's eyes flickered. "Buttons?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Or ribbon. One finds a roll of blue ribbon in the laundry account paid for by the Abbey, and yet there is no item in the stores matching that quantity, unless one looks in the ledger under maintenance." Manley shifted in his chair. "That's nonsense. Maintenance has nothing to do with the laundry." "Except when the laundry is maintaining a secret," Miss Marple replied. She reached into her bag and laid the tortoiseshell comb on the table. "Or when an item is removed from inventory to prevent awkward questions." Mrs. Hart's hand went to her hair instinctively. "Where did you get that?" "It was buried with a bundle of coarse linen under the lavender beds," Miss Marple said. "Linen with corners cut away, the sort one might use to wrap a body before carrying it to the riverbank." The silence was thick. Only the ticking of the vicar's clock filled the space. "Of course," Miss Marple continued, "it would take more than one person. One to fetch the linen, one to bring the lavender oil to disguise any smell, and someone with enough authority to send the laundry back with alterations." Fenwick muttered, "I told him it wouldn't stay buried." "Quiet," Manley snapped. Miss Marple folded her hands. "It is always the same. The lavender fades, but the truth remains." Her eyes rested briefly on Mrs. Hart. The colour had drained from the woman's face. She knew, and Miss Marple knew she knew, but the final naming would wait for tomorrow, when all could be heard in the open. Chapter 8. The Lavender Fades. The great hall of Warrender Abbey was not used often, but Sir Lionel had insisted. The long oak table was polished to a mirror, the high windows let in pale autumn light, and the fire was laid, though not yet lit. Inspector Dale stood at the head, Miss Marple at his side. Facing them were Dr. Lytton, Mr. Manley, Mrs. Hart, Fenwick, and Lady Ashcroft. The air had the faint scent of lavender drifting in from the cuttings drying in the still room beyond. Miss Marple began softly, as if telling a story over tea. 12 years ago, a young laundry girl named Lydia Harrow came to the Abbey for work. She was bright, quick with a needle, and pretty. Too pretty, perhaps, for her own safety. She caught the attention of more than one man here. But she refused certain advances, and one evening she was told to bring fresh linen to the orchard wall. She glanced toward Fenwick. "You were there to carry the bundle, weren't you? And you saw when she was struck. Not by you were too frightened, but by someone she trusted." Her eyes turned to Mrs. Hart. "You, madam, were in charge of the laundry. You had the means to send down the coarse linen, the oil to mask the scent, and the authority to order Manley's silence." Mrs. Hart's lips thinned. "You can't prove—" "Oh, but we can," Miss Marple said. "The photograph shows Lydia in her blue sprig cotton gown, speaking to Dr. Lytton on the day she vanished. The gown was found, mended, but stained with copper solution from the orchard. The tortoise-shell comb, yours, was buried with the linen. And the ledger shows blue ribbon purchased under maintenance, used to bind the bundle." Manley shifted uneasily. It wasn't my idea. No, Miss Marple agreed. Your part was to keep the ledgers tidy and the deliveries unremarkable. Fenwick dug the place, cut the lavender to replant over it, and Mrs. Hart ensured no one in the laundry spoke of the missing gown. Dr. Lytton's voice was low. Why would she kill her? Because Lydia knew something, Miss Marple replied. Something about an incident involving a guest's missing jewels, an incident that would have ended Mrs. Hart's comfortable place here. Lydia threatened to tell Lady Ashcroft. And so she was. Mrs. Hart stood abruptly, but Dale was already there, hand on her arm. Later, when the hall had emptied and the suspects had been taken away, Miss Marple lingered by the lavender beds. The scent was fainter now, almost gone. Funny thing about lavender, she murmured to Dale. It tries to cover, to sweeten, but the earth remembers. The inspector looked at her. And so do you. Miss Marple smiled, not without sadness. One must. They walked back toward the village, the abbey behind them silent at last.